Got a great question from a client today.
Tell
They
me.
said they read a research report about their industry. And for context, this is a biotech report. In particular, the client's going after biotech organizations. And the report detailed how biotech CEOs are thinking about their business, their future, their opportunities, their challenges, etc. And long story short, it painted a very pessimistic view of biotech. The disruption, challenges with the FDA, so on and so forth, and essentially predicted that there's going to be a lot of biotech firms going out of business, a lot of consolidation in the biotech industry. Okay. And so our client is naturally concerned. What does this mean? Do I pivot? Do I change industries? Is this just damning evidence that I'm never going to make money in biotech? What do I do with this information? Where do you start?
It's so interesting because the amount of times that I see somebody want to completely change their direction or their opinion on something because of one data source. Like if I had a dime for every time that happened, I would be a rich, rich woman. So I think, to me, I think the first thing is just putting this all into perspective, right? And understanding what does this mean in the grand scheme of everything that we know about the industry, and more specifically, what does it mean to your particular clients? Because it sounds like what you're talking about is a very generalized view, right? Something that has been extrapolated across an entire industry, and that doesn't necessarily relate to what this client is trying to do with their particular offering.
Yeah.
That's my first thought.
Yeah, and I think in fairness to this particular client, they're probably not one of the ones that is thinking, let's completely pivot and change everything off of one study. They asked an intelligent question about how to read the data, but you're not wrong. We see this all the time, is whether it's a study or some research or their own firsthand customer research that provides a finding that paints a picture of potentially some challenges in the industry, and there's this overreaction to to that data. And I think the first thing to ask is, how much evidence is enough evidence to support a pivot? And we've all heard these health research findings on the radio or on headline news, like research proves that drinking 10 cups of coffee will release this liver enzyme that does whatever. I'm making that up entirely, right? And that's like this very sensational headline, and people go, I should drink more coffee, it's good for my health. But if you understand anything about science, right, no scientist would treat one single data point or one single study as conclusive evidence, right? They're going to want to see multiple sources corroborating that point before concluding something to be true, categorically. And I think this is the same deal. That's one data point, but where else are you seeing evidence of this? Is there corroborating evidence from other studies, other research? And most importantly, and I really hesitate to encourage clients to draw any conclusions based on third-party research. Most importantly, what is your experience in the market, in your conversations with clients, with prospects, when you conduct market research, which is a big part of what we help clients do inside 90-Day Pipeline? Are you seeing evidence of this? Because it's quite possible that you're not, in which case take your real, tangible, firsthand evidence and experience as being stronger in weight than any kind of third-party report you might find.
Yeah, and so I think there's two things you're talking about here, right? If we kind of highlight it, which is one, volume of evidence. So, in the same way that you don't read one study, right? You want to do sort of a metadata review and look at a bunch of studies. If you're a scientist, you want to understand what the full picture is. So you want to understand volume. But I think the other thing that you're speaking to in the second half of what you were saying is the relevance of that information. And so, it might be that those observations are true, but that they are true at a level that is, much sort of higher or broader than what is important to you, or something that is much more specific than what is going to be useful to you. So there's also a real need to understand the relevance of that information and to get really clear about what it means, to your particular business, because what is happening in an industry at a broad scale may not in fact be what would happen when you're talking to your contact, right? Your buyer at an entirely different level. So yeah, I would say it is, volume, sort of scope of information, and relevance of information.
And understand where the bias might be.
Yeah.
I don't know where this was published in particular or who did the research, but guaranteed there's bias. If it's a third party research organization, then the bias is what's going to make good headlines, right? All things considered, biotech is falling apart is a better, more sensational headline that's going to get more downloads and more clicks and more review of the research than things are okay in biotech, right? Like there's always going to be bias. And if it's coming from a consulting or advisory firm or a software company, then they have bias. They're trying to sell products and services and consider that bias in your reading of the data. And again, to me, this is one of the reasons why you should rely more so on your firsthand data and experience, because that's a bias you can understand, right? Your bias, and you can parse through that data more effectively than you can somebody else's data.
You can, but I think it's also important to be aware of your own bias, right? And most importantly, sort of your confirmation bias, because it's really easy once you see that first article to start searching, biotech is falling apart and find more and more and more things that will support that. But as we know, like when you talked about health studies, right? You can find a completely opposing study for any fact, any purported fact that someone's putting forward. So, I think it's also worth, proactively or intentionally trying to research the other side of the argument so that you get, the other kind of conclusion, so that you get the full scope. And then you're in a good position to trust your own intuition, right? Then you're in a good position to draw your own conclusion, but also just be cautious, because it's really easy to get sucked down those sensationalist rabbit holes.
Yeah. It's kind of similar to the discussion we've had in the past about recessions.
Mm-hmm.
Are recessions an economic phenomenon that's worthy of understanding? Absolutely. Do economies recede and shrink from time to time? Absolutely. When you're in a recession, is it possible that some of your clients are growing? Absolutely. Even if your clients are not growing, if your market is receding and shrinking, is it possible that you can solve problems and make money? Absolutely. Could you do better in a recessionary environment sometimes than in an expansionary environment? Absolutely. Right. And this is, again, I think one of those circumstances where this report may have shown or may have argued that there's going to be a contraction in biotech and some firms will go out of business. Does that mean that you can't make money? Maybe that's true. Even if we accept that to be true, does that mean that you can't make money in that market? Not necessarily.
Yeah, for sure. And the other thing I'll add is that, you need to be really cautious of people making predictions. I think, in the last few years have seen more than, or at least maybe it just feels that way more than any time in history, how predictions can go completely out the window, right? The way that things are supposed to work no longer apply. The ability to decide because A and B happen that C is definitely the next path that we're on, I don't think is necessarily the case anymore. And you know what? Probably it never was. But, be really cautious, and especially cautious of people who are sure of their predictions, people who don't indicate that, that's exactly what it is, that don't, talk about the variability that exists, because, the folks that feel that sure are putting themselves in a position just, quite frankly, to be wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So then the question becomes, what do I do with this information? Perhaps it's not yet sufficient in terms of the data and the evidence to suggest that I need to pivot and move away from that market entirely. Is it useful data, and what do I do with it?
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I will always say is all data is useful data, right? And the last thing that you want to do is close your mind to that information. You need to be able to take it in. You need to be able to pay attention to it. But what you need to be able to do is see it as exactly that, right? Just another data point or set of data points. And when something, when you find something or notice something or read something that feels that strong, it's really important then to find the rest of the data points that are going to help you make sense of it. And so, in our world, what that means is doing outreach to the people who matter most to you, right? So to your market. This is where, customer research, customer listening, as we call it, this is where, if you haven't been doing it all along, which you absolutely should have been, this is where you want to make sure that you're dialing that up again so that you're hearing from the folks who really matter, right? The folks who really matter are the decision makers, and they're the ones who know how this is all playing out at their level, right? At the point at which they will make a decision to potentially work with you or not. So, I think that, the second step after first looking at the information and trying to right size it and understand where it's coming from and put it into perspective is to get more firsthand information yourself.
And use the data as a trigger, right? You can use that data as a discussion point. You can use some of the frames and some of the findings of the research to spark conversations with folks in the industry and get a take and get a perspective. This is great stuff to publish on LinkedIn and to get your target market to start to engage with and talk about and have a discussion around, because that's what experts do, right? They take these ideas and these theories and these findings, and they spark conversations. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you see it differently? So that's a big opportunity from a content perspective, from an outreach perspective, from a customer research perspective. I think at the end of the day, there's a spectrum here, right? Is there an end of the spectrum where the evidence is so overwhelming that this market's in trouble and that you don't want to touch it? Is that possible? Absolutely. It's rare. I rarely see it get there, but it's possible. Earlier on in that spectrum, can I use the information to inform my customer research prompts? Yeah, absolutely. Can I use the information to inform my offer? And again, to your point, I would still want to pair this with my firsthand research to be sure, but can I use it to inform my offer and my messaging and my positioning? Can I use that data to sharpen all of that, my value proposition? Absolutely. Can I use that data, like we talked about, to inform some of the content I publish and the discussions that I prompt via my thought leadership? Absolutely. So I think that, before a pivot, there's ample opportunity to use the data to inform your strategy at the different tiers that we just discussed. And there's a possibility that you need to pivot, but that's, I find a fairly rare occurrence.
And I think it's also important to note, like along the theme of this just being data, right? And by its nature, data is neutral. It's neither good nor bad, right? It's just information points. But it's also important to note that this is true when you see the article that says that your industry is going to blow up and expand and, everyone's going to be making money hand over fist. It's the same kind of process that you need to go through, because as much as that one's more welcome and more exciting and the thing that makes you, decide that you're on the right track or potentially that you're going to pivot to do something else, right? Based on this positive news that you're hearing, important to validate in any case the information that's coming through your doors.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the last angle here to potentially explore is, to your point, is it good or bad? Mm-hmm. Data doesn't have an opinion, right? Data is not good or bad. Data is what it is. And most people, I think, are reading things like this in this example as, well, that's bad, right? My market's struggling, it's contracting, some folks are going under, there's gonna be consolidation, that's bad. But is it bad? I recall a fairly well-known, growth consultant discussing the impact of recessions on their business. And I recall the statement being that my business underperforms in a growing economy. Why? Because in a growing economy, this is a growth consultant, in a growing economy, there tends to be some hubris. Clients tend to think that they've got everything figured out and they don't need help because they're growing, right? Like the tide is rising for everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Versus in a contracting economy or a recession, people tend to be more humble because things aren't working the way they used to be. And therefore, they tend to be a little bit more open to external advice and perspectives, therefore consulting and advice. And so, that's another lens through which to look at this for this client. I always tell people, where there's disruption, there's opportunity, right? So if you have evidence that, in this example, CEOs of biotech firms are concerned about, certain existential threats and market consolidation and FDA and so on and so forth, there's money there, right? Because those are all problems that, smart consultants can go in and start solving and start positioning around. And so that's a whole other lens through which to look at this is, yeah, there's a lot of problems here and I can make money. I can build a business around solving those problems.